You really don't remember me, do you? Judge Rebecca Whitmore's question seemed to drain every sound from the courtroom. I stood alone at the defense table, one hand resting on a brown folder stuffed with documents, while my uncle sat across the aisle beside his attorney. Gregory Bennett had worn the same calm expression all morning, the look of someone who had already decided how the hearing would end. His lawyer, Charles Whitaker, had been even more confident. He had a leather briefcase, neatly tabbed exhibits, and the easy courtroom manner of a man who knew exactly when to speak and when to let silence work for him. I had none of that. No legal team, no years of courtroom experience, just a dark navy suit, my hair pulled back, and everything I had managed to gather since my father died. Then Judge Whitmore looked at me again. You were wearing a uniform that night. My throat tightened. I stared at her, searching her face for something familiar. There was nothing. I'm sorry, Your Honor. What night? She mentioned Springfield, then Interstate 70, then a storm 7 years earlier. My fingers began to tremble against the edge of the table. I knew the road. I knew the storm. But I still didn't know why a judge remembered me from it. 3 months earlier, I had believed burying my father would be the hardest thing I would ever have to do. I was wrong. My father, Thomas Bennett, died at 64 after years of fighting heart disease with the same stubbornness he brought to everything else. He was private, practical, and almost aggressively self-reliant. If a sink leaked, he fixed it. If a cabinet door sagged, he took it apart before anyone could suggest calling a carpenter. If something broke twice, he considered it a personal challenge. His most important possession was never his bank account or his business. It was the house. A modest two-story place in Westerville, Ohio, where my mother and father had raised me. The siding needed work. The kitchen still had cabinets from another decade. The basement carried the permanent scent of wood dust because Dad spent years repairing furniture down there. None of that mattered. That house was home. My mother had died 6 years before him, and after she was gone, Dad barely changed a thing. Her blue coffee mug stayed on the second shelf in the kitchen. Her handwritten recipe cards remained framed beside the refrigerator. Her sewing machine still sat near the window where the afternoon light came through. Whenever I was away with the army and called during a rough week, Dad would sometimes send me a picture of the front porch. His message was always nearly the same. Come home when you can, porch lights on. His will was clear. The house went to me. Everything else was divided among family members. Gregory, my father's younger brother, received investments and personal property. No one was cut out. No one was left with nothing. But Gregory wanted the house. At first, I told myself his anger was grief. Families say strange things after funerals. Old resentments rise to the surface. People suddenly care about objects they ignored for decades. Then the letters began. Gregory claimed Dad had promised him the property years earlier. He said he had contributed money toward repairs and maintenance. He said Dad had relied on him financially and morally. Before long, his attorney turned those accusations into a formal claim against the estate. The first time I read the filing, I honestly thought someone had misunderstood something. My father had never once told me Gregory owned part of the house. Not once. I called attorneys. The first quoted a retainer large enough to make my stomach drop. The second could not take the case for months. A third spent 20 minutes reviewing the basic paperwork and warned me that probate disputes involving real property could become expensive fast. I had savings, but not unlimited savings. I was still transitioning out of the military, adjusting to civilian life, and planning repairs on the house. Every dollar I had already seemed to belong to something, so I kept looking for help while trying to prepare on my own. The court date arrived before I felt ready. That morning, I dressed with the same care I used to give my uniform: navy suit, plain blouse, hair tied back, no jewelry except my mother's small silver earrings. I carried one folder. Across the courtroom, Gregory had an attorney. When our eyes met, my uncle smiled. It wasn't cruel enough to call a sneer. That would have been easier. It was worse than that. It was relieved. As if my showing up without counsel confirmed what he had already assumed. Charles Whitaker spoke first. He told the court that Gregory had invested substantial sums in the property over the years, and that my father had intended to transfer ownership to him. He described their relationship as one of financial dependency and mutual understanding. Then he produced a document I had never seen before. An agreement. According to Whitaker, my father had signed it years earlier. The document was handed forward. I looked at the bottom of the page. Thomas Bennett. My father's signature. For several seconds, I forgot to breathe. It looked right. That was the terrifying part. The shape of the T, the long stroke at the end, the slight upward angle he always had when he signed quickly. Almost perfect. Maybe too perfect. Whitaker glanced at me. Mrs. Bennett, do you have an attorney appearing on your behalf today? No. He gave a small nod, understood. My face went hot. Judge Whitmore turned toward me. Mrs. Bennett, you understand that by proceeding today, you're representing yourself? Yes, Your Honor. My voice sounded thinner than I wanted it to. She reviewed the document again. Do you have evidence contradicting this agreement? I opened my folder. I had my father's will, property tax records, emails, notes, copies of receipts, a handful of documents I had spent nights arranging and rearranging across the dining room table. Until that moment, they had felt important. Under the fluorescent lights of a courtroom, they suddenly looked like scraps. Whitaker had organized exhibits and legal citations. I had a folder that still smelled faintly like my father's office. I looked toward Gregory. He was no longer tense. He thought it was over. Then Judge Whitmore stopped reading. Her eyes lifted from the paperwork and settled on me. She stared long enough that I wondered whether I had done something wrong. Miss Bennett. Yes, Your Honor. Her expression shifted. Not friendly, not exactly surprised. Recognition. You really don't remember me? I blinked. No, Your Honor, I'm sorry. She leaned back slightly. You were in uniform that night. My heartbeat quickened. Whitaker looked from the judge to me. Gregory's smile disappeared. Judge Whitmore named Springfield, then Interstate 70. Then she said there was a severe rainstorm. Something inside my memory opened. Headlights smeared by rain. Water streaming across pavement. A crushed car against a concrete barrier. But I still couldn't place her. Judge Whitmore looked down at the case file. I need to make a disclosure before this matter proceeds. Whitaker sat straighter immediately. She explained that she had encountered me years earlier under circumstances completely unrelated to the property dispute. She said there had been no ongoing relationship and no contact since, but the prior encounter was significant enough that she could not ignore it. Then she said something I never expected. She was recusing herself. Gregory turned toward his lawyer. Whitaker's face tightened. The judge made it clear that another judge would be assigned and that she would take no further part in the case. She was careful, formal, and precise. But before leaving the bench, she looked at the disputed agreement again. Then, at me. There is something in this record that warrants closer examination. That was all. No explanation. No advice. No rescue. She stood, and the hearing ended. I walked out of that courtroom in a daze. I had not won anything. Gregory's claim still existed. The house was still at risk. I still did not have full legal representation, and yet the certainty on the other side of the courtroom had cracked. I could feel it. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot with both hands wrapped around the steering wheel, trying to remember where I had seen Rebecca Whitmore before. Springfield. Interstate 70. A storm. 7 years earlier, I had still been serving in the Army. I had been driving back from a training assignment when a violent storm rolled across central Ohio. Rain hit the windshield so hard that the wipers could barely keep up. Traffic crawled. Thunder rattled the glass. Every set of headlights ahead looked distorted through sheets of water. Then I saw a sedan sideways near the median. Its front end had slammed into the barrier. Another vehicle had stopped farther back, with its hazard lights flashing. I pulled over. There wasn't time to think about whether I should get involved. Training takes over in moments like that. You assess what you can. You call for help. You keep people from making the situation worse. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911, and ran through the rain. A woman was trapped inside the sedan. The driver's side had taken the worst of the impact. Glass covered the seat and floor. She was conscious but terrified. Please, she kept saying, please don't leave. I'm not leaving, I told her. I couldn't get the door open, so I crouched near the broken window and reached inside far enough for her to grab my hand. She held on hard. I talked to her because there was nothing else I could do until emergency crews arrived. I asked where she lived. I asked whether she had children. I told her to breathe slowly. I told her help was coming, even when I couldn't hear sirens yet. Mostly, I kept repeating the one thing she seemed to need. I'm still here. Eventually, flashing lights appeared through the storm. Firefighters arrived. Paramedics moved in. Police began shutting down traffic. They had to cut part of the door away to free her. Before the paramedics closed the ambulance doors, the woman looked back at me. What's your name? Lauren. Lauren what? I smiled through the rain. Just Lauren is fine. She actually laughed. Weakly, but she laughed. Then the door shut. I never saw her again. At least, that was what I had believed. Sitting in the courthouse parking lot 7 years later, I suddenly remembered the woman's face without blood, rain, and shattered glass around it. Older now. Composed. Wearing judicial robes. Judge Rebecca Whitmore had been the woman in that car. I leaned back against the headrest, stunned. My phone vibrated on the passenger seat. A text from Gregory. Hope you enjoyed that little performance. I stared at it. Another message arrived almost immediately. You should settle while you still have the chance. I read both messages twice. Then I placed the phone face down. Something had changed. For weeks, Gregory had acted like a man who knew he was going to win. But those messages didn't sound confident anymore. They sounded impatient. And for the first time since he challenged my father's will, I wondered whether my uncle wasn't worried about losing the house. Maybe he was worried about what I might find if I kept looking. The case was reassigned several days later, and almost as soon as the new judge's name appeared on the docket, Charles Whitaker sent me another settlement offer on Gregory's behalf. The timing didn't feel accidental. They wanted the matter closed before anything else could be examined. The proposal was simple. I would surrender my claim to the house. Gregory would pay me a comparatively small amount, and both sides would agree not to pursue anything further against the other. I read the letter twice at my father's dining room table, then set it beside the framed recipe card my mother had written years before. For a few minutes, I tried to imagine accepting it. I could walk away. No more hearings, no more legal fees, no more nights spent staring at documents I barely understood. I could tell myself a house was only a building, and that peace was worth more than property. But then I looked through the window toward the front porch and remembered the photographs Dad used to send when I was away. The light glowing above the door. The same message every time. Come home when you can, porch lights on. I picked up the settlement letter again and realized Gregory wasn't asking me to compromise. He was asking me to surrender something my father had deliberately left to me. I wrote back that I would not accept. The next morning, I approached the case the way I had been trained to approach confusion in the Army. I stopped trying to understand everything at once and built a timeline. Dates first, facts second, assumptions last. I covered the dining room table with papers and started at the beginning. Dad had bought the house in 1998. Mom died in 2020. He updated his will in 2021. Gregory claimed he had been paying for major repairs beginning in 2019, and that those contributions were part of the reason Dad had supposedly agreed to transfer the property to him. I wrote each claim on a yellow legal pad, then matched it against whatever record I could find. Roofing work, plumbing, property taxes, insurance, exterior repair. Gregory's filings described years of financial support as if he had been carrying my father. The bank records told a different story. The first contradiction involved the roof. Gregory claimed he had paid for it in 2019. I found the contractor invoice, then the canceled check. The money had come directly from Dad's account. I checked another repair Gregory had listed, same result, then another. The more I compared his statements to the records, the weaker his story became. There were a few instances where Gregory had clearly helped with things, and I had no intention of pretending otherwise. He had bought materials once or twice. He had covered small expenses. He had helped Dad physically with projects after Mom died, but that was a long way from financing the house. Nearly every major cost Gregory was using to support his claim had been paid by my father himself. I sat back and stared at the papers. Why would you lie about something this easy to check? I said aloud. The house, of course, had no answer. I returned to the disputed agreement Whitaker had presented in court. It was still the piece of evidence that frightened me most, because everything else could be explained away as disagreement between brothers. That document looked official. It carried my father's signature. It had a witness. It appeared to have been notarized. If it was real, all the bank records in the world might not matter enough. Then I looked at the date. March 14, 2021. Something about it bothered me. I knew I had seen it before, but I couldn't immediately remember where. I went through Dad's medical files, which I had collected after his death because of the estate paperwork, and found the answer. March 14. He had been in the hospital. Dad suffered a cardiac episode that week and was admitted for 4 days. I found the admission record, the nursing notes, the physician's documentation. On the very day the agreement said he had signed away the house, he was receiving inpatient cardiac care. I read the date again. March 14, 2021. Then I looked back at the agreement. The room suddenly felt colder. Being hospitalized did not automatically make the document impossible. People sign papers in hospitals all the time. Lawyers visit patients, notaries can travel. Family members bring documents in. I knew enough not to jump from suspicious to impossible, but the agreement did not say it had been signed in a hospital. The circumstances Gregory's filing described made it sound like a normal private transaction, and nothing in the paperwork mentioned Dad being ill. I called one of the attorneys I had spoken with before the first hearing. He still couldn't take the case. But when I told him what I had found, his tone changed immediately. He asked me to read the date, then asked whether I had the hospital records and whether I had seen the original disputed agreement. I only have the copy that was submitted. Then try to get access to the original through the case, he said, and don't call your uncle and accuse him of forgery. The word made my stomach tighten. I didn't say forgery. You were thinking it. I didn't answer. If you're right, he continued, you don't need to scare anyone into an argument. You need to preserve the evidence and let the inconsistency speak. That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. I contacted Buckeye Community Legal Services and explained the situation. They could not simply take over every aspect of the case, but a lawyer there agreed to review the documents and give me limited assistance. Her name was Rachel Donovan. She had the calmest manner of anyone I had spoken with since the dispute began, which made me trust her more, not less. She didn't tell me I was obviously right. She didn't tell me Gregory was obviously lying. She asked questions. When I placed the disputed agreement in front of her, she studied it for several minutes before saying anything. This is your father's normal signature. It looks like it. Looks like it, and is it are two different things. She pulled out copies of other documents Thomas had signed over the years. We compared them side by side. The similarities were obvious, but once Rachel pointed out the differences, I started seeing them too. Certain strokes were unusually careful. Dad's real signature changed slightly depending on how quickly he was writing. The disputed signature looked almost like someone had chosen the cleanest version of his name and tried to reproduce it. Does that mean it's fake? I asked. No, it means I wouldn't assume it's authentic just because it resembles his signature. I showed her the hospital records. That interested her even more. This could matter significantly, she said. Then she pointed to another section of the agreement. Who is Diane Holloway? I looked at the name. I know who she is, or at least I used to. Diane had worked for Gregory's company years earlier. Rachel looked at me. She's listed as a witness. I nodded. Did she know your father? I don't know. Find out. That night, I searched through old emails, business listings, and public records until I found what appeared to be a current address. Diane lived in a small ranch-style house outside Columbus. The next morning, I drove there with a copy of the agreement sitting on the passenger seat. I parked across the street and stayed in the car for nearly 5 minutes. The strange thing was, I wasn't afraid of Diane herself. I was afraid of whichever answer she might give me. If she said she had watched my father sign the agreement, then perhaps everything Gregory claimed was true, and Dad had kept something enormous from me. If she said she had not witnessed it, then I was no longer dealing with a simple fight over an inheritance. I would be looking at evidence that someone had built a false story around my father's name. Either answer could change everything. I finally got out and knocked. A woman in her late 60s opened the door. Her gray hair was gathered loosely behind her head, and reading glasses rested low on her nose. Can I help you? Are you Diane Holloway? Her expression became guarded. Yes. My name is Lauren Bennett. Thomas Bennett was my father. She stared at me. I watched recognition spread slowly across her face, followed almost immediately by something else. Concern. Come inside, she said. Her living room was small and lived in, with family pictures covering one wall and a stack of magazines on the coffee table. She offered me coffee. I declined, mostly because I didn't think my hands could hold the cup steadily. I placed the agreement on the table between us. Diane didn't pick it up. She looked at the document, then at me. Where did you get this? My uncle submitted it in court. She went pale. I was afraid of that, she said. My heart started pounding. You recognize it? I recognize my name. I waited. Diane removed her glasses and set them beside her. Lauren, I never witnessed your father signing that document. The words landed harder than I expected. I looked down at the page. Then why is your name there? She took a moment before answering. Gregory gave me paperwork to sign when I was still working for him. He said it was related to some business matter. I signed where he asked me to sign. Did you read it? Not carefully enough. Was my father there? No. Did you ever see him sign anything? No. I looked directly at her. Then why would you sign something as a witness? Her eyes dropped to her hands. Because I trusted Gregory. For a second, I couldn't respond. My father had trusted Gregory too. Diane explained that she left Gregory's company a few months afterward. She remembered signing paperwork, but had never believed her signature would be attached to a property dispute after Thomas's death. Then, almost reluctantly, she added something else. Gregory contacted me later. When? After I left the company. What did he want? He told me if anyone ever asked about some documents I'd signed, I should stay out of it. I felt my stomach tighten. Why? He said talking would only create problems. Problems for who? Diane looked away. She didn't answer, and she didn't need to. I slid the hospital record across the table. My father was admitted to the hospital on March 14th, 2021. That's the date this agreement says he signed it. Diane's eyes widened as she read. Then it didn't happen the way this document says. That's what I'm trying to prove. She sat very still for several seconds, then looked toward the hallway. I might have something. She disappeared into another room and returned carrying an old cardboard box. Inside were tax papers, photographs, envelopes, and several notebooks. She dug through them carefully until she found a small black one with worn corners. When I worked for Gregory, I wrote everything down. Appointments, closing times, who came in, who didn't, things I needed to remember. She flipped through the pages. Then stopped. March 14th. I leaned forward. She turned the notebook toward me. In blue ink beside the date, she had written that the office closed early, and that Gregory left at approximately 3:30. There was no meeting with Thomas. No note about my father. Nothing that resembled the transaction described in court. I read the entry twice. Would you be willing to speak to Rachel, the attorney helping me? Diane hesitated long enough for me to understand exactly how much I was asking. Gregory had once been her employer. She had signed documents because she trusted him. Now I was asking her to become part of a legal dispute involving a family she barely knew. Finally, she nodded. Yes. I felt tears gathering behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall there. Before I left, Diane followed me to the door. I'm sorry, Lauren. I turned. For what? For not asking what I was signing. I didn't know how to respond. On the drive home, I kept thinking about those words. Maybe betrayal did not always begin with one enormous decision. Maybe sometimes it grew from small acts of trust. A signature someone didn't examine. A question someone didn't ask. A warning someone chose to ignore because asking more would have been uncomfortable. When I got home, there was a message from Gregory. Stop digging. Nothing else. No greeting, no threat he could later deny, just 2 words. I saved the message. The next morning, Rachel reviewed everything Diane had given me. She read the notebook entry, studied the hospital records again, and compared them with the agreement. This is significant. Can we prove the document is false now? Not yet. I must have looked disappointed because she immediately continued. What we may be able to prove is that the document could not have been executed in the manner being claimed. That matters, but we need more. What kind of more? Contentation. We need to know where your father was, where the notary was, whether Diane actually witnessed anything, and whether the signatures and notarial record line up with official records. I nodded. Then we find them. A small smile crossed her face. You're starting to understand how this works. I'm trying. Court isn't supposed to be about which person tells the more dramatic story. It's about what each side can establish. That afternoon, we examined the agreement again and focused on the notary section. The name beneath the seal was Franklin Pierce, an Ohio notary who was still licensed. I contacted his office. He would not discuss the transaction with me directly, which Rachel had expected, but he agreed to preserve any relevant records if they were requested through the proper process. Several days later, Rachel called. Lauren, we got access to the journal entry. I stood up from the kitchen table without realizing I had done it, and there's a problem with us, with the agreement. I gripped the phone. The notarization reflected on your uncle's document does not appear in Pierce's official journal. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Rachel continued. There's no entry showing your father appearing before him for this property agreement on March 14th. So it's fake. Don't get ahead of the evidence. I closed my eyes. I was beginning to recognize that phrase as one of her favorites. The safe statement, she said, is that the document is inconsistent with the notary's official records. We still need to establish exactly what happened. Then her voice changed. There may be another issue. What? Diane's signature. I waited. The signature appearing on the disputed agreement may not be consistent with verified examples of her signature from the same period. I sat down slowly. The agreement was beginning to fall apart from every direction. My father had been hospitalized. Diane said she never saw him sign it. The notary journal did not contain the transaction. Even the witness signature might not be what it appeared to be. For the first time since Gregory filed his claim, I could see a path forward. Then Charles Whitaker filed another motion. He accused me of harassing members of the family and attempting to manufacture a dispute where none existed. Gregory argued that my objections should be dismissed and that I was using grief to justify a campaign against him. The language infuriated me. Rachel warned me not to respond emotionally. At the next hearing, Whitaker stood with the same polished confidence he had shown the first time we faced each other. You're chasing ghosts, Ms. Bennett, he said. I didn't answer. Gregory leaned toward him and whispered something. Whitaker gave a small smile before turning back toward me. You understand that eventually you'll have to prove these accusations. I looked down at the brown folder in front of me. Weeks earlier, that sentence would have terrified me. Now, for the first time, it didn't. Because he was right. I did have to prove it. And buried inside an old notary journal was a fact Gregory apparently never expected anyone to check. The notary journal changed everything. 2 days after Rachel Donovan finished reviewing the relevant records, she asked me to come to her office. By the time I arrived, she had arranged copies of the disputed agreement, Franklin Pierce's journal pages, my father's hospital records, and Diane Holloway's statement across her desk. She tapped the date on Gregory's document, March 14, 2021. According to this agreement, your father signed the property transfer that afternoon, Diane witnessed it, and Franklin Pierce notarized it at 4:15. I nodded because by then I knew the date, almost as well as my own birthday. Rachel slid the journal toward me and pointed to the entries for that day. There was no Thomas Bennett, no property transfer, and no transaction remotely resembling the one Gregory had submitted to the court. More importantly, Pierce had made a note in his own journal that his office closed early that afternoon because of a family emergency. The supposed notarization had occurred after the office was already closed. My father had been hospitalized. Diane had never seen him sign the agreement, and now the notary's official records showed that the certification on the document did not fit what had actually happened that day. So it's fake, I said, unable to keep the anger out of my voice. Rachel's expression remained careful. She told me we had strong evidence that the agreement was inconsistent with the official record, but that was not the same as proving exactly who had created it, altered it, or arranged for it to be presented. She reminded me that courts cared about what could be established, not what seemed obvious once enough suspicious details were placed next to one another. I understood what she meant, but understanding did not make the situation easier to accept. Gregory had stood beside my father at family funerals, eaten dinner at our kitchen table, helped repair the backyard fence after my mother died, and spent holidays inside the very house he was now trying to take. He was not some stranger trying to exploit a grieving family. He was family, which somehow made every false claim feel worse. Rachel must have seen the anger building in me, because she warned me not to confront him. Right now, you have something more useful than an argument, she said. You have evidence. Don't trade that for a conversation he can deny later. I knew she was right. The military had taught me that reacting too quickly could turn an advantage into a mistake, and Gregory had already shown how eager he was to frame my investigation as harassment. So I left Rachel's office without calling him, without answering his messages, and without giving Charles Whitaker anything new to use against me. Instead, I drove back to my father's house and began looking for something more important than proof of what Gregory had done. I wanted to understand why my father had never warned me how serious things had become between them. Dad had always been organized in an old-fashioned way. He printed emails other people would have stored online, kept receipts in labeled folders, and wrote reminders in spiral notebooks that accumulated in his office year after year. That night, I opened drawers I had avoided since his death, because touching his things still felt like entering a room where he might walk in and ask what I was doing. I went through old tax returns, insurance papers, business records, repair invoices, and stacks of notes that meant almost nothing to anyone but him. Hours passed before I noticed a small locked metal box beneath a pile of older financial documents. I recognized it immediately. Dad had owned it for as long as I could remember, but I had never known what he kept inside. I searched the desk until I found a small key taped beneath the bottom drawer. When the lock opened, I expected deeds, bank records, maybe old jewelry belonging to my mother. There were some photographs, several insurance documents, old statements, and a handful of handwritten letters. At the bottom of the box was a sealed envelope with one word written across the front in my father's handwriting: Lauren. My hand started trembling before I even opened it. I had spent months reading documents that contained my father's name and signatures, medical charts, court filings, and financial records. But seeing my own name written by him felt completely different. For a few seconds, I simply held the envelope, because opening it felt like hearing his voice again, and losing him again at the same time. The first line almost made me stop. My girl, if you're reading this, something has happened that I hoped would never happen. I put the letter down, took a breath, then forced myself to continue. Dad wrote that Gregory had asked about the house more than once, and that he had refused him just as many times. He acknowledged that his younger brother had helped him during difficult years and said he would never deny that help. But he also wrote that assistance did not become ownership simply because the person providing it later wanted something in return. As I read, I realized Dad had understood Gregory's resentment long before I did. He had known there was a possibility his brother might challenge the estate, and he had been worried enough to leave me an explanation in a locked box. Then I reached the part that changed the house for me. Dad wrote that my mother had wanted it to remain a place where our family could always come home. I looked up from the page. Her photograph was still hanging nearby. Her old sewing machine was still beside the window. Her blue coffee mug was still in the kitchen because Dad had never been able to move it after she died. For years, I had assumed he left me the house because I was his daughter and because parents leave property to their children. The letter told me something deeper. The decision had been connected to a promise between my parents, something they had discussed while my mother was still alive. Dad had not viewed the property as a prize to be divided. To him, it was the physical place where their family still existed. Near the end of the letter, he wrote, "If Gregory challenges the will, don't fight him because you hate him. Fight him because I made a promise to your mother." I read that sentence several times. My anger did not disappear, but it changed shape. Until then, part of me had been fighting because I wanted Gregory to lose. I wanted him exposed. I wanted him to feel the same helplessness he had forced on me when I stood alone in that first courtroom. My father's words reminded me that he had not left me instructions for revenge. He had left me a responsibility. I pressed the letter against my chest and sat in his chair for a long time, surrounded by everything he had spent years refusing to throw away. There was one more object in the metal box, a small USB drive. That surprised me almost as much as the letter. Dad had never trusted technology when paper would do. He printed boarding passes, printed receipts, printed emails, and once called me because he could not figure out why a photograph he had saved was no longer on his desktop. I turned the drive over in my fingers before connecting it to my laptop. Only 3 files appeared. The first was a folder of photographs of the house. The second was a scanned copy of an older version of his will. The third was an audio file. I clicked it. At first, there was only faint static and the low background noise of a room. Then my father's voice came through the speakers. "If you're hearing this, Lauren, I'm sorry." Every muscle in my body went still. His voice sounded weaker than I remembered, tired in a way he always tried to hide whenever we spoke while I was away. He said he had not wanted to involve me in the disagreement. Then another voice entered the recording, and I recognized Gregory immediately. He was telling Dad that he was making everything harder than it had to be. Dad answered that he was not making things difficult. He was making his decision clear. Gregory did not need the house. Dad did not need the house. I did. Gregory laughed and asked why Thomas would leave everything to a daughter who barely came home. The words hurt, even though I knew where they came from. I had spent years carrying some version of that guilt myself. Deployments, training, assignments, and long stretches away from Ohio had cost me birthdays, holidays, and ordinary Sundays I would never get back. Gregory had found the exact wound to press, but my father answered before I could even process it. She serves this country. Don't mistake distance for abandonment. I covered my mouth with my hand as the recording continued, because I had never heard him defend me that way. Dad was not a sentimental man. He loved through practical things, oil changes, repaired furniture, a porch light left on, not speeches. Hearing those words years after the conversation had happened almost broke me. Then Gregory asked a question that turned my sadness into something colder. What if she doesn't come back? There was no long pause in my father's answer. He said the house would remain mine anyway. Gregory continued arguing. He admitted he was in financial trouble and said the property could save his business. He tried guilt, history, and resentment. He reminded Dad of the times he had helped him. He argued that family should look after family. Dad acknowledged what Gregory had done for him but refused to change his decision. Near the end of the recording, his voice became unmistakably firm. If anything happens to me, Lauren gets the house. There won't be any confusion. The file ended, but I remained sitting in the dark office with my laptop open in front of me. I played the recording again, then a third time, listening not only to the words but to the tension beneath them. Gregory had not simply hoped Dad might leave him the property. He had asked for it directly and been refused directly. He knew exactly what my father wanted. More importantly, Dad knew the dispute was serious enough to record it. That meant the document Gregory later produced was not merely convenient evidence supporting his version of events. It appeared to contradict a decision he had already heard Thomas state in his own voice. The next morning, I gave the USB drive and the original letter to Rachel. She made copies but insisted that the originals be preserved carefully. Then she listened to the recording from beginning to end without interrupting. When it finished, she sat quietly for a moment before telling me it could become extremely important. The recording would still need to be authenticated. They would have to establish where the file came from, examine its metadata, preserve the original device, and confirm the voices if Gregory challenged them. Rachel would not let me skip steps simply because the content sounded convincing. By then, I appreciated that about her. Every time I wanted to leap from evidence to conclusion, she forced me to build the bridge properly. Then she raised a question I had not considered. Do you know whether Gregory knew your father had recorded that conversation? I told her I had no idea. Rachel explained that if Gregory had known Thomas was documenting their dispute, it could give context to why another written agreement suddenly existed. One that appeared to override both the will and the position Dad had stated on the recording. She was careful not to claim that was what had happened, but the possibility settled heavily between us. For the first time, the false-looking agreement no longer seemed like an isolated piece of questionable paperwork. It could have been part of an effort to create a version of my father's intentions that would survive after he could no longer contradict it. The pieces were beginning to connect, but one part of the story still seemed separate from everything else. Judge Rebecca Whitmore. Her recognition of me had changed the direction of the first hearing, yet it had nothing to do with my father's will, Gregory's financial trouble, Diane's signature, or Franklin Pierce's journal. I assumed it was simply a strange coincidence, one of those moments when two lives cross unexpectedly after years apart. Then, that afternoon I received a formal notice related to Judge Whitmore's recusal. Because she had recognized me from the highway accident 7 years earlier, she had disclosed the prior encounter and provided the court with information confirming the circumstances so the record would be clear about why she stepped away from the case. I read the emergency report mostly out of curiosity. It described the storm, the damaged sedan, the arrival of first responders, and the people identified at the scene. My own name was there. Rebecca Whitmore's name was there. I almost put the document down until another name caught my eye. Gregory Bennett. I stared at it, convinced for a moment that I had misread it. Then I checked again. There was no mistake. My uncle had been listed as one of the people present at that accident scene 7 years earlier. I searched my memory of the storm. I remembered the wrecked sedan, the rain running into my eyes, Rebecca gripping my hand through the shattered window, firefighters working around the car, emergency lights reflecting off the pavement, and other vehicles stopped along the highway. I remembered people moving in the distance, but I did not remember seeing Gregory. He had never once mentioned being there. Not afterward, not during family gatherings, not when I told Dad about helping an injured woman on the highway. If Gregory had recognized the story, he had said nothing. I called Rachel and told her about the report. She was quiet while I explained where his name appeared. When I finished, she asked me to send her a copy and told me not to contact Gregory about it. I asked what she thought it meant. She said we did not know yet, and that being present at an accident scene 7 years earlier did not automatically connect him to the property dispute, but her voice had changed. She heard what I heard in the coincidence. Gregory had been part of a moment in my life that I barely remembered until Judge Whitmore recognized me, and somehow that same man Fane was now at the center of a fight over my father's house. After the call, I sat at Dad's desk with his letter beside me and the emergency report open in front of me. Until then, I had believed the conflict began when my father died and Gregory challenged the will. The recording had already pushed that beginning farther back, showing me that the fight over the house had started while Dad was still alive. Now the accident report pushed another unanswered question 7 years into the past. I still did not know why Gregory had been on that highway, whether his presence mattered, or whether it was nothing more than coincidence. But one thing had become impossible to ignore. Every time I examined a part of the story I thought I understood, I found another piece my uncle had never expected me to see. The house was still the center of the case, but I was beginning to wonder whether it was only the final piece of a much older story, and the next hearing would be the first time Gregory had to sit in a courtroom while all of those pieces were placed in front of him. The next hearing began at 9:30 on a gray Tuesday morning. By then, the question of why Gregory's name appeared on the old accident report was still unresolved, and Rachel had warned me not to force a connection simply because the coincidence unsettled me. Being present at the same highway accident 7 years earlier did not prove anything about the house, the disputed agreement, or my father's estate. If that detail eventually mattered, we would deal with it when we had facts. For now, she wanted me focused on what we could establish. Strangely, that made me calmer. I had spent weeks feeling as though every unanswered question was a threat. That morning, I finally understood that I did not need to solve every mystery before walking into court. I only needed to present the truth we could prove and let each piece stand where it belonged. I carried the same brown folder I had brought to my first hearing, but it had become almost unrecognizable. It was thicker now, divided into sections, and backed by records I had once thought I would never find. Inside were my father's will, his hospital records, property statements, bank documents, Diane Holloway's written account, Franklin Pierce's notary records, copies of Dad's letter, and the preserved USB drive containing the recording of his conversation with Gregory. Rachel sat beside me. She still was not taking over every aspect of the case, but she had agreed to assist with the legal issues surrounding authentication and the evidence we were presenting. The difference between that morning and the first time I walked into court was not that I suddenly had a powerful legal team. It was that I was no longer standing there with nothing but grief and suspicion. Across the aisle, Charles Whitaker sat beside Gregory. Whitaker still looked polished and controlled, although the easy confidence I remembered from our first hearing had faded around the edges. Gregory looked worse. He kept glancing toward the folder in front of me, then away, as though he were trying to guess which document would be opened first. When the judge entered, everyone stood, and after the formalities were finished, Whitaker began with the same basic story he had been telling from the beginning. According to him, the agreement reflected Thomas Bennett's genuine intention to transfer the house to his brother. Gregory had supposedly contributed substantial money toward the property. My father had supposedly acknowledged that contribution, and my objections were being driven by grief rather than evidence. Whitaker then turned the dispute into something more personal. He told the court that I seemed determined to transform an ordinary estate disagreement into an accusation against my own family. The words landed exactly where he intended them to. For a second, I wanted to stand and tell him that I had not created any of this. I had not invented the agreement. I had not put Diane's name on it. I had not chosen March 14, 2021. Rachel leaned slightly toward me and murmured, "Don't give him the reaction." I kept my eyes on the documents in front of me until the judge finally turned in our direction and allowed us to respond. When I stood, I did not talk about what kind of man my father had been or how much the house meant to my mother. Those things mattered to me, but Rachel had taught me that they were not where the strongest argument lived. "My objection is not based on what I think my father wanted," I said. "It's based on what the records show." The first exhibit was the hospital documentation. The clerk received it, and the judge reviewed the relevant dates. While I explained that Thomas Bennett had been admitted for a cardiac episode during the week the agreement was supposedly executed. On March 14, the date appearing on Gregory's document, my father was an inpatient receiving treatment. Whitaker objected almost immediately. He argued that hospitalization did not prove my father was incapable of signing paperwork and that no one had established he was unconscious or legally incompetent. Rachel had prepared me for exactly that argument. We were not claiming incapacity. We were establishing location and circumstance. The document presented by Gregory suggested a transaction that had supposedly occurred in the ordinary course of events, yet nothing in their account explained why a man hospitalized with a heart condition had executed a property agreement that afternoon. The judge noted the objection and allowed us to continue. The second exhibit was harder for Whitaker to dismiss. Rachel submitted the relevant pages from Franklin Pierce's official notary journal. I watched the judge compare the journal with the disputed agreement. Gregory's document represented that my father's signature had been notarized at 4:15 p.m. on March 14. Pierce's records contained no entry for Thomas Bennett, no property transaction, and no notarization matching the agreement. More damaging still, the journal noted that Pierce's office had closed early that day because of a family emergency. Whitaker rose and said his side disputed our interpretation of the records. The judge looked at him and asked what alternative interpretation he was offering. For several seconds, he had no answer. He eventually suggested there could have been an off-site notarization or an incomplete journal entry, but those possibilities were not supported by anything he had submitted. For the first time, I watched the confidence on his side of the courtroom turn into something closer to calculation. Then Diane Holloway was called. She walked toward the witness chair slowly, holding herself with the nervous stiffness of someone who had spent days wishing she could avoid the room altogether. She swore to tell the truth, sat down, and folded her hands in her lap. Rachel began by establishing that Diane had worked for Gregory's business during the period in question, and that she had signed paperwork he placed in front of her. Diane admitted that freely. She did not try to make herself look more careful than she had been. She said Gregory had told her the paperwork concerned business matters, that she had trusted him, and that she signed where he indicated without examining everything as closely as she should have. Then Rachel showed her the disputed agreement. Diane confirmed that her name appeared in the witness section, but she also stated clearly that Thomas Bennett had not been present when Gregory brought the paperwork to her. She had never watched my father sign the document. She had never heard him acknowledge that signature. She had not met with him that day at all. When Rachel asked whether she had knowingly signed as a witness to Thomas transferring his home to Gregory, Diane answered no. Whitaker took over on cross-examination. His first questions were careful, almost friendly. He asked how many documents Diane had signed during her years working for Gregory, and whether she could remember every piece of paperwork she handled. She admitted that she could not. He asked whether several years had passed since the events in question. She agreed. Then he placed the document in front of her and asked, "Mrs. Holloway, is that your signature?" Diane examined it. "It appears to be." Whitaker's expression changed slightly, as if he had finally found the opening he wanted. "So you agree that you signed the document?" Diane looked up at him. "I agree that I signed paperwork Gregory gave me. I did not witness Thomas Bennett sign away his house." The distinction seemed to irritate him. He asked whether it was possible she simply no longer remembered the event accurately. Diane paused, adjusted her glasses, and looked directly at him. "I forget where I put my glasses while I'm wearing them," she said. "I would remember watching a man sign away his home." A quiet reaction moved through the gallery, but the judge brought the room back to order. Whitaker tried to weaken the notebook Diane had kept, suggesting that personal notes were not the same as official company records. Diane agreed with that too. She did not exaggerate what she had. She simply explained that she had spent years recording appointments and work details for her own use, and that her entry for March 14 showed Gregory leaving early with no meeting involving Thomas Bennett. By the time she stepped down, her testimony had not proven who created the disputed agreement, but it had made Gregory's explanation considerably harder to believe. Rachel waited until Diane was seated again before turning to our final major exhibit. "I knew what was coming, but Gregory did too." The moment Rachel told the judge we were offering an audio recording relevant to Thomas Bennett's intentions regarding the house, Gregory's face changed. His eyes moved toward me, then to the small evidence bag containing the USB drive. Whitaker immediately asked about foundation and authentication. Rachel explained that the original device had been preserved, that the file had been copied without altering the source, and that the metadata and voices could be examined through the appropriate process. She did not ask the court to skip any requirement. She simply asked permission to present the recording subject to proper authentication. When my father's voice filled the courtroom, I stopped watching the judge and looked at Gregory. "If anything happens to me, Lauren gets the house," Dad said on the recording. "There won't be any confusion." Gregory stared at the table. Then his own recorded voice followed, accusing my father of leaving everything to a daughter who barely came home. Hearing the words in my father's office had hurt. Hearing them in a courtroom while Gregory sat only a few yards away felt different. There was nowhere for the resentment to hide anymore. Then, Dad answered him with the same sentence that had stayed with me since the night I discovered the file. "She serves this country. Don't mistake distance for abandonment." No one moved when the recording ended. Whitaker rose slowly and requested time to challenge its authenticity. The judge agreed that the evidence would have to be properly authenticated before receiving final weight, but then she asked a question neither Rachel nor I had expected. She looked directly at Gregory. "Mr. Bennett, leaving aside the technical authentication of the recording for a moment, do you dispute that the voices heard were yours and your brother's?" Whitaker immediately leaned toward him. Gregory's jaw tightened. "No," he said. The judge waited. "You do not dispute that this conversation occurred?" Gregory closed his eyes for a second. "No." Whitaker whispered something urgently to him, but Gregory seemed no longer able to stop himself. He looked toward the USB drive and said, almost under his breath, "I just didn't think she'd find it." For a moment, I felt as though the entire case had disappeared beneath that one sentence. The judge asked him what he meant. Whitaker stood before Gregory could answer and requested a recess. The judge granted it, and the courtroom emptied into the hallway in a slow wave of voices and footsteps. Rachel told me not to speak with Gregory alone about the evidence, but before we could move far from the courtroom, he approached me. He looked older than he had that morning. Not physically older in the ordinary sense, but stripped of whatever confidence had kept him upright through the earlier hearings. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "I understand enough. I was going to lose everything." I stared at him. "So you were going to take Dad's house?" His face tightened. I thought he owed me. "He didn't. I helped him. And he appreciated that. That wasn't enough." The words came out with more pain than anger. Until that moment, I had assumed Gregory's desperation was mostly financial. The recording showed that his business had been in trouble, and the house represented money he believed could save him. But standing in the courthouse hallway, I realized the debt he thought my father owed him was not measured entirely in dollars. Gregory had spent years comparing his life to Thomas's. Every success Dad had became proof, in Gregory's mind, that his brother had received something he had been denied. Every time the family turned to Dad, every time Dad solved a problem, every time I came home in uniform and my father looked proud, Gregory added another line to an invisible account that only he could see. The house had become the final symbol of all of it. "You think Dad chose me over you," I said. Gregory looked away. "You wouldn't understand. He was my father. You were his brother. Those aren't competing positions." He gave a bitter little laugh. "It never felt that way." Before I could answer, Rachel approached, and the conversation ended. I returned to the courtroom understanding more about Gregory than I had before the recess, but understanding him did not make what he had done acceptable. Resentment could explain a betrayal. It could not erase it. When the hearing resumed, Whitaker no longer wore the faint smile I remembered from the beginning of the case. He asked for additional time to examine the audio file, the notary records, and the other exhibits. Rachel did not oppose a reasonable opportunity for authentication because we wanted the evidence tested properly. The judge granted a limited continuance and made clear that the purpose was to resolve the authenticity questions, not to restart the dispute from the beginning. The weeks before the final hearing were quieter than everything that came before them. Franklin Pierce confirmed that his official journal contained no record of notarizing the alleged agreement for Thomas Bennett. His records supported the fact that his office had closed early on March 14. Diane reaffirmed her testimony and the circumstances under which Gregory had obtained her signature. My father's hospital records established that he had been admitted when the supposed transaction occurred. The audio file was examined and authenticated sufficiently for the proceeding, and the preserved USB drive supported the chain Rachel had carefully established. We also submitted the bank and property records showing that the major expenses Gregory claimed to have paid had in fact come from my father's accounts. No single piece of evidence carried the whole case. That was what struck me most. The truth did not arrive like some dramatic confession that instantly solved everything. It accumulated: a hospital date, a canceled check, a notebook entry, a missing notarization, a woman willing to admit she had trusted the wrong person, a recording my father had hidden inside a metal box because somewhere inside him, he must have known his spoken refusal might one day need to survive him. Each piece on its own left room for argument. Together, they formed something Gregory's version of events could no longer withstand. At the final hearing, the judge reviewed the record methodically. Whitaker argued where he still could, but the case he had presented at the beginning had changed beyond recognition. The supposed financial contributions were contradicted by bank records. The witness had denied witnessing the transaction. The notary had no official record of it. The date collided with my father's hospitalization, and the authenticated recording captured Thomas stating directly that the house was to remain mine, despite Gregory's request for it. When the judge finally delivered the ruling, I gripped the edge of the table beneath my hands. She rejected the disputed agreement. Gregory's claim to the house was denied. The property would remain part of my father's estate and pass to me under his valid will. I did not cheer. I did not turn toward Gregory to see his reaction. I closed my eyes and thought of my father sitting at the kitchen table, probably with a cup of coffee cooling beside him, writing the letter I had eventually found in that metal box. I thought of my mother's blue mug on the shelf and the porch light Dad had left burning whenever I was away. For months, I had imagined victory as the moment Gregory lost. Sitting there after the ruling, I understood that was never what I had really wanted. What mattered was that my father's decision had survived after he was no longer there to defend it himself. Outside the courthouse, Rachel gave me a few minutes alone before leaving. I stood near the steps watching people move between the building and the parking lot, expecting to feel lighter than I did. The case was over. The house was mine. Gregory's story had collapsed under the records he never expected anyone to examine. Yet relief came mixed with exhaustion and grief, because winning did not bring my father back, and it did not restore the family that existed before his brother decided resentment gave him the right to take what was not his. I heard Gregory behind me and turned. He had been crying. "I'm sorry," he said. I studied his face, looking for the argument that usually came after his apologies, the explanation that would somehow make him the injured person again. None came. "I know that doesn't fix anything," he continued. "No," I said, "it doesn't." He nodded and looked toward the courthouse doors before facing me again. For several seconds, he seemed unable to ask whatever he had followed me outside to say. Then his voice dropped. "Can I see the house one more time?" I had imagined this moment for months, but never this question. I had imagined Gregory angry after losing. I had imagined myself finally telling him every cruel thing I had swallowed since the lawsuit began. I had even imagined walking away, while he stood there knowing exactly what it felt like to have something taken from him. Instead, as I looked at my uncle on the courthouse steps, I felt none of the triumph I had once expected. I only felt tired, and somewhere beneath that exhaustion, I heard my father's words again. "Don't fight him because you hate him." Gregory waited. I looked at the man who had tried to take my father's last gift from me and realized that the court had decided what belonged to me. The harder question was what I would do with the victory now that I had it. "Yes," I said, "you can see the house." We drove separately from the courthouse. Gregory followed several car lengths behind me, and during the entire trip back to Westerville, I kept wondering whether I had made a mistake by saying yes. The court had just rejected the agreement he used to challenge my father's will. I had spent months proving that the financial story behind his claim did not match the records. I had listened to my father defend me on a recording Gregory never thought I would find. There were still possible legal consequences surrounding the false document, and nothing about the judge's ruling erased what had happened. Yet when I turned onto my father's street and saw the house at the end of the block, I knew I had not invited Gregory back because I trusted him. I had invited him because the case was finished, and I needed to find out whether I could enter that house again without carrying the courtroom inside with me. I parked in the driveway and waited until Gregory pulled up along the curb. Neither of us spoke as we walked toward the front door. When I put the key in the lock, he stopped a few feet behind me. His eyes moved over the porch, the faded trim, and the front hallway visible through the glass. "Your dad painted that hallway himself," he said. I looked back at him. "I know." A faint smile appeared and disappeared almost immediately. He hated that color after he finished it. I nearly laughed because that sounded exactly like Dad. "He chose it." Gregory nodded. "That's why I never stopped making fun of him for it." For one brief second, the lawsuit vanished, and I could hear the two brothers they had once been, teasing each other over bad paint choices and unfinished projects. We stepped inside. Nothing had changed since the court fight began. Mom's photograph was still on the mantel. Dad's recliner remained beside the living room window. His reading glasses were in the small dish near the chair, because I still had not been able to bring myself to move them. Downstairs, his tools were arranged above the workbench in the same order he had kept for years. Gregory walked slowly, as though he had expected the place to look different now that it belonged to me. In the living room, he stopped in front of an old photograph of himself and Dad, standing beside their first car. They were young in the picture, both grinning with the reckless confidence of men who had no idea what time would eventually do to them. I had seen the photograph hundreds of times, but that afternoon I noticed how close they were standing. Gregory reached toward the frame and touched one corner. "He was always better at everything," he said. I looked at him. "That isn't true." He gave a small shrug. It felt true. He sat on the edge of the sofa and stared toward the photograph while he spoke. When Dad bought the house, Gregory had been struggling financially. When Thomas's business became stable, Gregory was still trying to keep his own from failing. After their mother died, Thomas became the person everyone called when something had to be handled. Gregory said he spent years watching his older brother become the dependable one, the successful one, the man the family trusted. Then he looked at me. "And then you came home in uniform, and he looked at you like you were the best thing he'd ever done." I did not answer immediately. The comment would have infuriated me months earlier because I would have heard it as another accusation. That day, I heard what was underneath it. Gregory had not simply wanted my father's property. He had built a life around comparing himself to Thomas, and every comparison ended with him deciding he had lost something. Dad's house became one more symbol in that private competition. "You thought taking this place would make something even," I said. Gregory lowered his head. "I thought it was the last thing I could take from him." The admission was so ugly and so plain that neither of us could pretend we had misunderstood it. I looked around the room where my parents had raised me. That wasn't the house talking, I said. That was your anger. Gregory nodded without defending himself. I know. For a while, all I could hear was the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Then Gregory said, I lied. I looked at him. I know. He shook his head. No, I mean about all of it. He admitted that he had exaggerated the amount of money he contributed to Dad's property, and had repeated those exaggerations until he almost believed them himself. He had helped Thomas over the years, but nowhere near the level he later claimed. When Dad refused to give him the house, Gregory's financial problems and resentment fed each other until he began telling himself that he deserved compensation. Eventually, he pressured someone connected to his business to help prepare paperwork that would make his claim look stronger. He did not try to explain away the witness problem or the false appearance of notarization. He knew there could still be consequences for the document and for the way it had been used in court. I listened without interrupting him. Part of me wanted to tell him that consequences were exactly what he deserved. He had forced me to spend months defending my father's wishes while I was still grieving him. He had tried to use my years away with the army as proof that I somehow mattered less. He had taken the insecurity I already carried about missing time with my parents and turned it into part of his case. If I wanted justification for hating him, I had more than enough, but I also had my father's letter. Don't fight him because you hate him. Dad had never asked me to shield Gregory from accountability. He had simply warned me not to let the fight turn me into someone cruel. I can't pretend none of this happened, I told him. Gregory nodded. I know. I said he had hurt me, damaged whatever trust remained between us, and tried to take the last major thing Dad left behind. Nothing he said in that room could erase those facts. Gregory kept his eyes down. I know, he repeated. I took a breath and told him something I had not been sure I believed until I heard myself say it. But I also don't want to spend the rest of my life hating you. Gregory looked up. The relief on his face was immediate, but I stopped him before he could mistake what I meant. Forgiveness was not the same as forgetting, and it was not permission to avoid consequences. If there was a legal process related to the false document, he would cooperate completely. He would stop all claims against the estate. If legitimate debts remained between him and Dad's business affairs, they would be handled honestly, with records instead of stories. Gregory agreed to all of it. We did not hug. Nothing about that afternoon was clean enough for an embrace. Some relationships do not heal because one person finally says sorry, and some wounds become worse when people rush to call them closed. What happened between Gregory and me would take time, if it healed at all. But something had shifted. I no longer needed him to suffer before I could move forward. I only needed him to stop lying about what he had done and accept whatever came next because of it. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the front door and looked back into the house. Your dad would be proud of you, he said. I followed his gaze toward the porch and the light fixture above the door. It was the same light Dad used to leave on whenever I was away. I hope so, I said. Gregory stepped outside, walked to his car, and drove away. I remained in the doorway until his taillights disappeared at the end of the street. After he left, I went into the kitchen and stood there alone. The room had spent months feeling like an evidence storage area. Every counter had held some part of the dispute. Bank statements, court notices, medical records, copies of the will, notes from Rachel, printouts from property searches. I had begun to see Dad's dining table as the place where I built arguments, rather than the place where we ate Thanksgiving dinner. That afternoon, for the first time since he died, the house stopped feeling like a case I had to win. It felt like home again. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Judge Rebecca Whitmore. The envelope surprised me because the case was no longer hers and had not been since she recused herself. The letter contained no legal advice and made no comment on the final ruling. Instead, she wrote about the night we first met on Interstate 70. She told me she remembered sitting trapped in that crushed car, terrified by the storm and the pain, while a young woman in uniform reached through a broken window and promised not to leave. She had not known my full name. She had not known where I lived. She had not known whether our lives would ever cross again. But she remembered my face and the sound of my voice telling her that she was not alone. Rebecca also explained why recognizing me in court had forced her to step away. The encounter had been meaningful to her, and because of that, she knew she could not allow even the appearance of personal gratitude to influence a case involving me. Justice had to be fair to both sides, including Gregory. She had not recused herself so another judge could help me. She had not handed me a victory. In fact, she had done the opposite of giving me special treatment. She had removed herself precisely because doing the right thing required her not to participate. That distinction mattered to me more than I expected. For weeks after the first hearing, I had thought of Rebecca's recognition as the moment that saved the house. It wasn't. Her recusal bought me no guarantee of success. The new judge still required evidence. Gregory's attorney still challenged me. Diane still had to tell the truth about what she had signed. Franklin Pierce's records still had to be examined. My father's recording still had to be authenticated. Rachel still had to help me understand how to turn suspicion into something a court could actually consider. Rebecca had simply recognized someone she once knew and then made the ethically necessary decision to remove herself. I folded her letter and placed it in the metal box beside Dad's. Their messages were different, but they left me with the same idea. Character is easiest to talk about when people are watching. The real test is what you do when there is no reward waiting for you. 7 years earlier, I had stopped on a highway because someone needed help. I never expected to see that woman again. Years later, Rebecca stepped away from my case, even though gratitude might have made her want to help me. Dad had refused to let resentment change the way he divided his own property, even when his brother pressured him. In different ways, all of those choices mattered because they were made before anyone knew what the consequences would be. I eventually started repairing the house. I fixed the siding and dealt with the plumbing issues Dad had postponed because he insisted they were not emergencies yet. I replaced a section of flooring near the back door and repaired the porch railing. There were things I could have changed simply because they were old, but I found myself preserving more than I expected. Mom's blue coffee mug stayed on the second shelf. Dad's workbench remained exactly where he left it. His tools stayed arranged along the basement wall. I even kept the hallway paint Gregory and I had joked about, despite finally admitting to myself that Dad really had chosen an awful color. I made one change that mattered to me. I placed a small table on the front porch with a couple of chairs around it. There was nothing expensive about it. On quiet evenings, I could sit there with coffee and watch the street. When relatives visited, we could sit outside and talk without turning every memory of the house into a conversation about who owned what. Over time, that porch became a reminder that the property had never really been valuable because of its square footage or its resale price. My parents had spent years turning it into a place where people could come back. That was the inheritance Dad had been trying to protect. The lawsuit also taught me lessons I wish our family had learned before anyone walked into a courtroom. A will matters, but so does keeping it current and making sure the people who need to know about it understand where it is. Property records, beneficiary information, receipts, financial records, and important communications can become critical after someone dies. My father's habit of saving everything was one of the reasons I could eventually challenge Gregory's claims. Families like to believe that everyone will behave reasonably after a death. Sometimes they do. Sometimes grief, money, old resentment, and unfinished arguments combine in ways no one expects. I also learned that asking for legal help is not weakness. When I walked into that first hearing alone, I believed courage meant standing there without anyone beside me and refusing to back down. What I eventually understood was that courage also meant admitting when I did not know enough. Rachel never turned me into a lawyer. She did something more valuable. She showed me where my assumptions ended and where proof had to begin. For people who cannot afford full private representation, legitimate legal aid organizations, bar association referral programs, and other local resources may provide options, depending on the case and jurisdiction. Civil and probate disputes can become complicated quickly, and I learned how dangerous it can be to assume determination alone will make up for legal knowledge. For a long time, I told myself I wanted revenge. I wanted Gregory embarrassed. I wanted him exposed. I wanted the man who smiled across the courtroom while I stood there alone to understand exactly what that moment felt like from my side. But revenge would only have given me another reason to stay connected to what he did. Justice gave me something else. It gave me the truth, documented clearly enough that no one could replace my father's decision with a more convenient version. Forgiveness gave me something different again. It did not excuse Gregory. It simply gave me the possibility of living the rest of my life without carrying him everywhere I went. I still remember the first courtroom clearly. I remember the folder in my hands and the heat rising into my face when Charles Whitaker asked whether I had counsel. I remember Gregory's quiet smile and the terrifying moment when I saw my father's signature on a document I had never seen. Most of all, I remember Rebecca Whitmore looking directly at me and asking, "You really don't remember me, do you?" For a while, I believed that question changed my life because the judge remembered something good I had once done. Eventually, I understood that the important part was not being remembered. It was being reminded. That night on the highway, I had not stopped because I expected gratitude. Rebecca had not recused herself because it helped her. Dad had not left me the house so I could defeat Gregory and spend the rest of my life celebrating that victory. He trusted me with it because he believed I could protect what mattered without allowing the fight to destroy everything else around it. The greatest inheritance my father left me was never the house. It was the standard he expected me to live by when protecting it became difficult. Money can disappear, property can be sold, families can fight over objects until the objects mean more than the people who once lived around them. What lasts longer is the person you become when life gives you every reason to be bitter, and you decide bitterness will not make your choices for you. Sometimes, when I come home after dark, I still turn on the porch light before I go inside. No one is away waiting for Dad's message anymore, but I leave it glowing for a while anyway. It reminds me of him, of my mother, and of a house that almost became the reason a family destroyed itself. Now, when I see that light from the driveway, I do not think about the lawsuit first. I think about what Dad always meant when he sent me those photographs from home. The light is on. You can come back. If this story reminds you of someone in your own family, maybe the question worth asking is not only what you would fight to protect, it is what you would refuse to become while fighting for it. There are victories that leave people with nothing but another wound to carry. And there are victories that finally allow them to put something down. I thought winning meant making Gregory pay. What I really needed was the truth, accountability, and enough mercy to keep his choices from shaping the rest of my life. Sometimes the greatest victory is not making someone suffer for what they did. Sometimes it is walking away with what mattered protected and your heart still capable of coming home.